So this actually lets me talk about a really interesting interaction between math and science. You think that infinity is not math, it's philosophy, it's a made-up answer to a malformed question. And here's the thing, you very may well be right. Math is not science. Math is very useful for science, but it's not science. Science requires observation, verification, rigorous testing. Math doesn't actually need to do that. You can just make up concepts in math. And then you can use those concepts, and if they're useful, you can keep them. So, like, the idea that infinity exists hasn't actually been proven in physical reality. That's why I always say infinity is a concept. It is not something that's been proven to be scientifically accurate. It's extremely useful in detailing mathematical scientific formulas, but science has not proved a single physical infinity to ever exist. So we just basically make up the concept of infinity because it is useful in our math. And then making up the concept of omega, the first number past infinity, is also useful in our math. And there are even bigger infinites than that. You can take a power set of an infinity to get a bigger infinity. You can end up doing omega to the omega to the omega to the omega. And all of this stuff we just sort of say exists. But that doesn't mean that it has a correlation in physical reality. And in fact, the interesting thing about set theory and about talking about multiple infinities is that it might be cyclical. Like, a number larger than anything we've talked about is something called an inaccessible number. It is a number that you can't ever reach. But many mathematicians argue that an inaccessible number is just the very first infinity, the smallest infinity, because we've never reached it. And many of you in the comments said stuff like, wait a minute, so does that mean that omega is 1 because there's an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1? And that, too, is a thing that some mathematicians argue. So in diving into set theory, the biggest numbers might also be the smallest numbers, because quantity doesn't work linearly the way it does in standard mathematics. And that's why you can't offhandedly say, oh, well, this amount of infinities is definitely bigger than this infinity. Because it might be the case that all the infinities in the world that you could possibly count might be no bigger than 1. And in fact, one of the holy grails of set theory is finding an infinity that is so absurd, that has so much quantity in it, it essentially allows you to prove that 0 is equal to 1, something that is literally not true in the physical world. So yeah, math is not science. It's just very, very useful for science. And so a lot of these infinite concepts are just being made up because it's an interesting thing to dive into, but it doesn't necessarily reflect reality.